Update 3. My boss made me sign a zero overtime policy BC. I was clocking 2 to 5 minutes of overtime per week. So I followed it perfectly. Productivity dropped 40% in 1 week. Friday was the worst day. We had a seasonal surge. Extra volume from a quarterly promotional cycle one of our retail accounts runs. Under normal circumstances, my shift would handle the surge by starting the priority picks first thing and running a tight schedule all day. I'd usually stay an extra 8 to 10 minutes on surge days to make sure the evening shift had a clean handover. Not this Friday. I left at 2:30 on the dot. The surge orders were about 70% complete. The other 30% evening shift's problem. Productivity was down by about 35 to 40% compared to the previous week. I know this because I tracked it. I've been tracking daily output metrics for 6 years. It's part of my job. Or it was. At 3 p.m. on Friday, I got an email from Vince. Subject line, performance discussion Monday 9 a.m. I forwarded it to my personal email and saved a copy. Wait. Vince is calling a performance meeting with the guy who's following the policy Vince himself created. This is like a gym teacher who banned running and then called a meeting because nobody was winning the relay race. The bean counter squeezed a nickel so hard it turned into a quarter. A quarter of the productivity they used to have. Let me run some numbers. Cole's overtime cost the company about $280 a year. The late shipments this week probably cost them tens of thousands in customer satisfaction, potential contract penalties, and the overtime the evening shift had to work to catch up on what the day shift left behind. Vince, my man, you didn't save money. You spent a fortune trying to save pocket change, and now you're blaming the cash register. Monday morning, 9 a.m. Vince's office. This time, Vince had someone from HR with him, a woman named Jackie, who I'd met once at an orientation session. She seemed uncomfortable. Vince was not uncomfortable. Vince was in full "I've identified the problem" mode. He started by pulling up the week's shipment data on his laptop. He turned it toward me like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Cole, last week, we saw a significant decline in day shift throughput. Our on-time shipment rate dropped from 96% to 61%. We had 14 customer complaints and the evening shift logged an additional 42 hours of overtime to compensate for incomplete handoffs. I nodded. He was right about the numbers. I'd tracked them myself. He said, "Can you explain what happened?" I said, "I followed your zero overtime policy." He blinked. "What do you mean?" I said, "You asked me to commit to zero overtime. I signed a document. I followed it. I clocked in at 6 a.m., not 5:45 like I used to. I clocked out at 2:30 p.m., not 2:33 or 2:35 like I used to. I did not stay past my shift for any reason. As per the commitment form, everything that wasn't completed by 2:30 was passed to the evening shift." Jackie, the HR person, was writing things down very quickly. Vince said, "You stopped coming in early." I said, "That was unpaid time, Vince. The commitment form says zero overtime. Coming in early without being clocked in is a wage violation. I was protecting the company by not working off the clock." His face did a thing. I've seen that face on managers before. It's the face of someone who realizes they've built a trap and walked into it. He looked at Jackie. Jackie was still writing. He said, "Cole, the intent of the policy wasn't to compromise operations. It was to reduce unnecessary overtime." I pulled out my copy of the signed form. I said, "Vince, the form says zero overtime. It doesn't say some overtime is okay. It doesn't say use your judgment. It says zero. And it has your signature right here." I followed it to the letter. If the operation suffered, that's because the policy didn't account for the operational reality of running a 300 shipment per day distribution center, which I tried to explain when you asked me to sign it. Jackie stopped writing. She looked at Vince. Then she said, "Vince, can you step out for a moment? I'd like to speak with Cole privately." Vince left. Jackie closed the door. She said, "Cole, between you and me, I told Vince this policy was going to cause problems. He implemented it without consulting HR." She asked me if I wanted to file a grievance. I said, "No," I said, "I just wanted to do my job the way it needs to be done." She said, "I'll handle it." Jackie called me the next day to follow up. She said the form was going to be rescinded and asked if I had any concerns going forward. I said I just wanted to do my job. She said, "Cole, for what it's worth, your time card records are the most consistent and reasonable I've seen in this facility. The overtime issue was never an issue. It was manufactured by someone who didn't understand the operation." I thanked her. She said, "Also, off the record, that was the best malicious compliance I've ever witnessed in 20 years of HR. I'm not supposed to say that, but I thought you should know." She hung up before I could respond. Jackie's all right. 2 days later, the zero overtime commitment form was officially suspended pending review. Vince sent me an email, not in person, email saying that adjusted overtime guidelines would be communicated in the coming weeks. The adjusted guidelines never came because there was nothing to adjust. The old system where I used my judgment and occasionally stayed 3 minutes late had worked fine for 6 years. "Yo, Jackie," the HR rep, told Vince to step out of his own meeting. "Step out." She big brothered him in his own office. That's the corporate equivalent of being sent to your room by the babysitter. And Cole, my man Cole, pulled out the signed form and read it back to him. It says zero. It has your signature right here. That's not malicious compliance. That's a masterclass in contract enforcement. The bean counter wanted precision. He got precision. He got exactly what he asked for. Delivered exactly how he asked for it. Documented exactly as he required it. And it cost the company 42 hours of evening shift overtime in 1 week, which at time and a half rates is roughly carry the one about 1,000 times more than Cole's 2 to 5 minutes ever cost. The math is mathing. I also want to mention what happened with the drivers. Our regular drivers, guys who'd been picking up from our dock for years, were the collateral damage of this whole thing. A guy named Earl, who drives for one of our biggest accounts, was sitting in his truck on Wednesday afternoon waiting for a load that should have been ready by 2 o'clock. At 2:30, I walked past his truck on my way to clock out. He rolled down his window and said, "Cole, what's going on? I've been sitting here 30 minutes. I said, "New policy. My shift ended. Evening crew will get to you." He said, "Cole, I've got 2 more stops today. If I'm late to those, my dispatcher is going to have my head." I said, "I'm sorry, Earl. My hands are tied." He looked at me, really looked, and said, "They're making you do this, aren't they?" I just nodded. He rolled his window back up and waited. Earl called the account management team that afternoon. The account management team called Vince. Vince called me at home. At home on my personal phone after hours and asked why I didn't stay to load Earl's truck. I said, "Because I signed a 0 overtime commitment form. Loading Earl's truck would have required 4 minutes past my shift. I was not authorized." There was a long pause. Then Vince said, "We'll discuss this Monday." I said, "I'll be there at 6 a.m. sharp." Here's where things stand now. The 0 overtime policy lasted exactly 1 week. One glorious catastrophic 40% productivity drop week. It has not been mentioned since. My time card is back to its normal pattern. 2 to 5 minutes of overtime per week, give or take. The company survived. The customers forgave us mostly. The evening shift still gives me a hard time about the week from Satan, but they know it wasn't my doing. Vince is still here. He hasn't been fired or reassigned, but he's different. Quieter, less iPad, less 4 a.m. emails. I think the regional director's 800% comment scared him straight. Or maybe he realized that distribution isn't a spreadsheet. It's a living, breathing operation that requires judgment, flexibility, and a supervisor who's willing to stay 3 extra minutes to make sure a truck gets loaded.